Hey everyone. Today we continued talking about the carbon cycle. Our last class was also about the carbon cycle. That was more about like the different carbon stores in the carbon cycle. So different places that actually stored carbon. Today we're going to talk more about carbon flows, which are how carbon moves from one carbon store to another carbon store. This is all part of climate change basics. So we're still just learning all about the basics of climate change so that after winter break, we can talk about climate change and understand all the specific details of climate change and how it affects our planet. So first, today's warm-up is what is one way that carbon moves from one carbon reservoir to another carbon reservoir? A carbon reservoir is anything that stores carbon. So that could be like a plant, an animal, it could be like the land, the water, the atmosphere, anything that stores carbon. So here's a quick hint for this warm-up question. The air is just one carbon reservoir. So carbon cannot move from the air to the air. That's not a way that carbon moves from one reservoir to another reservoir. So you should pick something else. All right. And so go ahead and pause the video to answer that question. And then when you're ready, come back. All right. So today's agenda, we just did the warm up. Next, we're going to do a bit of a recap of last lesson. Then we'll talk about carbon flows. In class, we played a carbon cycling Kahoot, which is available for you to play on Google Classroom. And then lastly, we did our exit slip. So the focus question for today is how does carbon move throughout the Earth? And the learning target, what you'll be able to do is you will be able to use a model to explain how carbon moves from one location to another. So this is what you'll be able to do at the end of today. All right, so let's quickly recap. So last class we talked about carbon stores. We talked about how there are carbon stores in each major sphere of the planet, which would be the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. So starting with the biosphere is all living things on Earth. That is plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, humans. All of these things are part of the biosphere. And if something is living, it's always in the biosphere. It doesn't matter where the thing lives. So if something lives underground or in water or somewhere in the atmosphere, if it's living, it's always part of the biosphere, no matter what. The atmosphere that's just all the air surrounding Earth. So that's the sky, that's the air we're breathing, all of those things are the atmosphere. The hydrosphere is all the water on Earth. And the geosphere is all the land on Earth. So it's like land, it's all the rocks on Earth. It's like different like crystals and gemstones and like coal and stuff. And it's also all the magma in the Earth's core. All of those things are the geosphere. So there is carbon in all four of these spheres. Right. So that was what I wanted to review with you from last class. Next, there's one tiny little thing I want to tell you, and that is that when we talk about carbon, we're actually talking about carbon the atom or carbon the element. So carbon is an atom, and it is a building block of lots of different molecules. When it's in a molecule, we write carbon as a C. So for example, this molecule, you can see that there is a C in the middle. That would be carbon. And then on the sides, we have two O's, which are oxygen. So this molecule is one that you actually know. It's one C, two O's. That's actually CO2, carbon dioxide. So you can see carbon is right in the middle of this carbon dioxide. Another molecule that you've definitely never seen before, but you know all about this molecule. Again, we've got some carbon in the middle, and then we've got some oxygen, we've got some hydrogens. This is sugar. And so again, sugar has carbon inside of it. And then the one other molecule that I wanted to show you is this molecule is just carbon. All you see is C's. This is actually a diamond. The structures here, the molecules here, they don't matter. But what I'm trying to show you is that carbon is different from carbon dioxide. So from now on, when I'm talking about carbon, I'm actually talking about the atom or the element, which could be found in many thousands of different molecules, probably millions of different molecules. And when I talk about carbon dioxide, I'm just talking about this molecule here, just CO2. So that was something that I think some people were confused on last class. So I just wanted to review that with you. All right, cool. So we're going to talk about carbon flows today. And a carbon flow explains how carbon moves from one reservoir to another. So the way that we're going to do this, we're actually going to review some of the different carbon flows that we talked about in Carbon Cycle Part 1. So from that game that we played on Jamboard. And as we review this, I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about carbon flows by the sphere that they flow from. So first I'm going to start with the atmosphere, then I'm going to go to the hydrosphere, then the geosphere, and then the biosphere. When I talk about these spheres, I'm going to talk about different ways carbon leaves those spheres and where they go to. So in this carbon flow section, I'm going to give you a lot of details. The details are not super important. The most important thing that you need to know is how carbon leaves from a sphere and how it goes to another sphere and what that process is called. So for example, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, I know you guys haven't learned about photosynthesis, but photosynthesis is the process that plants use when they take energy from the sun and convert carbon dioxide into sugar. So plants are really cool because they make sugar that they can then eat, but they make sugar right from the air. It'd be really cool if we could do that. But so photosynthesis causes carbon to move from the atmosphere to the biosphere. So that right there is what you need to know about all of these carbon flows. You need to know where the carbon comes from, in this case, the atmosphere, where the carbon goes to, in this case, the biosphere, and what process causes the carbon to move from one place to another place. In this case, photosynthesis. All right, so plants are just they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into sugar in their own bodies. So the carbon's moving from the atmosphere to the biosphere. All right. The next way that carbon moves is through a process called diffusion. So diffusion means spread out. Diffuse means spread out. So diffusion explains why things dissolved in water like to spread out. So, for example, if you take a spoonful of, let's say, sugar, and you put it in a cup of water, you just take a spoonful of sugar, just dump it in a cup of water, don't stir the cup, and then just walk away. When you first dump the sugar is all going to go down to the bottom of the water, the bottom of the cup, and it's just going to kind of pile up there. But if you walk away and you come back in maybe like an hour, that sugar is going to be gone. And that's because the sugar first dissolved in the water, and then it diffused. So then it spread out through the water, which means if you take a small sip from the top of the cup of water, it's now going to be kind of sweet. And that's because the sugar molecules have spread out in the water. So that's what we see here. If someone, let's say this is just a bunch of sugar, someone dumped it in the cup, it's going to eventually spread out. That process is called diffusion. And so carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it actually diffuses. So whenever you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide is going to spread out until all around the Earth, until the amount of carbon dioxide is about balanced all around the Earth. And believe it or not, carbon dioxide can also go into the hydrosphere. So it can go into water, tiny little bubbles of carbon dioxide. And it also diffuses underwater. But here's the really cool thing. The atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide in the hydrosphere can also diffuse to each other. So if we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and we have carbon dioxide in the hydrosphere, the carbon dioxide can actually move from water to air or from air to water until both are balanced, which is, I think that's really interesting. And so this is one way that carbon can leave the atmosphere. So carbon leaves the atmosphere and goes to the hydrosphere by the process of diffusion. All right, next is the hydrosphere. So carbon can leave the hydrosphere a few different ways. First is aquatic animals building their shells. So some aquatic animals have shells that are made of calcium bicarbonate. So you can see carbon's right in that word. And so when these aquatic animals build their shells, when they make their shells, they're actually just taking carbon right from the water and putting it into their bodies, into their shells. And so when aquatic animals build their shells, that causes carbon to move from the hydrosphere to the biosphere, which you can't really see, but the carbon goes from the hydrosphere to the biosphere. All right, next, another way that carbon leaves the hydrosphere is through photosynthesis again. So aquatic plants like algae use energy from the sun to convert the carbon dioxide in water into sugar. So algae and other plants that live underwater can do the same thing. They take carbon dioxide from the water around them, use it to make sugar in their bodies. Again, that'd be really cool if we could do that. But when aquatic plants use photosynthesis, they are causing carbon to move from the hydrosphere to the biosphere. And again, that process is photosynthesis. And just once again, carbon can leave the hydrosphere through diffusion. So it can leave the water and it can go into the air. Diffusion, which means spread out. All right. The third sphere is the geosphere. There are two main ways that carbon leaves the geosphere. The first way is weathering and erosion. So when water runs over some rock or some soil, it actually picks up some of that rock and soil, and then it carries that rock and soil and carbon to the basin of the watershed. So rocks and soil have carbon in them, and when the water runs over them, it picks up their carbon and takes that carbon to like the nearest lake, pond, or ocean. So when this happens, erosion causes carbon to move from the geosphere to the hydrosphere, right? So all this brown water that's carrying carbon, it's taken all that carbon to the hydrosphere. And then the other way that carbon leaves the geosphere is through volcanic eruptions. So when volcanoes erupt, they release a bunch of carbon into the atmosphere. So this is a really, really, really big way that carbon leaves the geosphere, leaves land, and goes into the atmosphere. It's through volcanic eruptions. All right, and then we have the biosphere, which is the last sphere that we have to talk about. So the first way that carbon leaves the biosphere is when plants and animals breathe. So when you breathe out, you are actually breathing out carbon dioxide. And before that carbon dioxide was carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it was actually carbon inside your body. So your body converted carbon inside it into carbon dioxide and then released it. So breathing is one way that carbon leaves the biosphere and goes into the atmosphere. All right, and then when plants and animals die, that's another way carbon leaves the biosphere. And when plants and animals die, there are two things that can and do happen. The first thing is decomposition. The second thing is burial. So when plants and animals decompose, decomposers actually use oxygen to break down the bodies of dead organisms. So remember when we studied dead zones, we learned about how when algae dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, decomposers in the ocean use up all the oxygen in that water to decompose these dead algae. What I didn't tell you when we talked about dead zones is that decomposers also breathe out carbon dioxide from the bodies that they're breaking down. And so this is another way that carbon leaves the biosphere when bodies decompose. And this can happen underwater or on land. So it can happen underwater like in a dead zone, or it can happen on land like this beached fish. So we are we're taking carbon from the biosphere and we are either adding it to the hydrosphere or to the atmosphere. The other way that carbon can leave dead bodies is through burial. So the bodies of dead organisms sometimes get buried in sediment, like these two dinosaurs. When that happens, the carbon in their bodies goes into the rock. It becomes rock. So burial causes carbon to move from the biosphere to the geosphere. There we go, to the geosphere. All right. And then there's one last little thing that I have to mention about the biosphere, and that is that carbon actually moves around in the biosphere a lot, and that's through predation. So, whenever an animal eats a plant or an animal eats another animal, they're taking energy from their food. They're also taking carbon from their food. So when this deer eats the leaf, all the energy in that leaf is going to the deer, but also all the carbon in that leaf is also going to the deer. And so because plants and animals because animals are constantly eating other things, the carbon moves around a lot within the biosphere. Cool. So now if you go on Google Classroom, there's a post called Lesson 27 Kahoot. You can go ahead and play that Kahoot by yourself. Then when you're done with that, we're actually going to do the exit slip. So on Google Classroom, there's a post called Lesson 27 Exit Slip. At the top of the exit slip, you're going to see this diagram. The diagram has the four spheres. It has the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. In between each sphere is an arrow. And each arrow is labeled. Your job is to find the correct label for each of these arrows. When you do this, you have to pay close attention to the arrow direction. So for example, there's an arrow that points from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere. There's also an arrow that points from the hydrosphere to the atmosphere. So you have to think really carefully about which arrow is which of these labels. So for example, A, which points from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere, maybe that's decomposition or respiration or diffusion from air to water. Right? So go ahead and choose the correct label for each of these things. An important note is that each answer will only be used one time. So once you use an answer once, you don't have to worry about that answer again. So you're going to do that for all of these arrows. And then at the bottom, there's another question. It says, number 2, why are aquatic plants and aquatic animals not part of the hydrosphere? So aquatic plants and aquatic animals are part of, I'm not going to tell you, but why are they not part of the hydrosphere? Right. If you have any questions, let me know. You can leave a private comment on Google Classroom and I will get back to you. But otherwise, I hope to see you in class next time.